Well, that's it for season 15. All done with Leela, K9 Mark 1. It's time for another new sea change in the show. Welcome to the Time Treadmill. I'm Ron, and these are my sweaty thoughts about Doctor Who. So much left to talk about in this story, so let's get started. The Invasion of Time, the final episode, shows the most extensive use of the interior of the TARDIS in the history of the program. Probably 90% of the final episode takes place inside the TARDIS, with the Doctor and Leela and various other people wandering around inside the deep guts of the TARDIS. It is remarkable. And there won't be another story that spends this much time deep inside the TARDIS until 40 years later in the Matt Smith era. So that alone makes this story amazing. But of course, it's also noteworthy for being the final appearance of Leela and for K9 Mark 1. And both of those are kind of interesting stories. And that's because for both of them, the producers and the writers left it up in the air until the last possible minute to decide whether or not they would be carrying on. In the case of K9, it was a decision on the production side, and it had to do with the prop itself. K9 Mark 1 was a notoriously difficult prop on set. The viewers loved K9, but the actors and the technicians on set hated working with the robot. It just malfunctioned constantly. It was difficult to use. And so strong consideration was given to just throwing out the character. But he was so popular, and the prop shop guaranteed that they could build a better, more properly functioning prop for the following series if the show were to keep him on. And so at the end of this story, K9 Mark 1 gets left behind on Gallifrey, but the final shot has the Doctor wheeling out a box with K9 Mark 2. We'll get to him next year. Now, one other interesting thing about this version of K9 Mark 1 is presumably the iteration of K9 that ultimately gets sent back through a time vortex and winds up in the Australian TV series K9 from last decade. And as a side note, I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to watch that as part of this walkthrough of the project. Technically, I should. I hated it so much the first time through, I swore to myself I wouldn't put myself through it again. I'm killing back and forth on that, and honestly, I have a long time before I get to the point where I have to make that decision, so we'll see where that goes. Now, of course, the other major departure was Leela, and that came down not to the producers. They very much wanted Louise Jameson to stay on for another season, but it came down to the actress herself. Throughout the filming of the story, Louise Jameson hadn't quite made up her mind either way, and that left the writers in a pickle. They had to kind of create an escape hatch for the character without committing to that escape hatch. And ultimately, the character decides to stay on Gallifrey because she's fallen in love with Captain Anders, and that's weird. There is no developing romance throughout the course of the story. It's not like Dalek Invasion of the Earth, where you can slowly see the blossoming romance between Susan and her paramour. No, in the case of Leela and Anders, they're on screen several times together, but there really is no indication of any kind of spark between the two of them. Quite frankly, if Leela was going to stay behind for someone, based on the way the story executes, I would find it much more likely that she stays behind with Rodin, the female Time Lord. They spend quite a bit of time together and become fairly close, but this was 1978. That kind of departure was never going to happen. I doubt it even occurred to anyone at the time. Or if it did, it was a very sly background thing, which I seriously doubt. So, obviously, ultimately, Louise Jameson decided to leave the program, and her reasons were her difficult working relationship with Tom Baker. Now, Tom Baker stands as easily the most popular Doctor, certainly of the classic era, and many people regard him as the best Doctor of all time. He certainly had the longest tenure in the role, and his performance as the Doctor just can't be argued with. It was phenomenal. That being said, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say essentially every female companion, particularly after Sarah Jane Smith left, had difficult working relationships with Tom Baker. Frankly, he wanted to do the show himself. He didn't think he needed any companions. And on that point, I think he was mistaken, but what do I know? I wasn't there. In any case, Louise Jameson ultimately decided to depart the show, and so a last-minute romance gets thrown in, and she stays behind. Now, interestingly, the characters of Leela and K9 Mark I and Captain Anders, those were carried on extensively in the Big Finish audio range, and there's an entire storyline to do with all of them and her staying behind on Gallifrey and forming a life. I would be actually very interested in seeing Louise Jameson show up again as an aging Leela. The actress is still around and totally capable of doing it. I think it would be a wonderful cameo or guest appearance to have, but I don't suppose that will ever happen. In any case, I've been rambling on for quite a while. Tomorrow I start the next season, and it's a biggie. It's the first one that has a season-long story arc with the entire Key to Time sequence. It also features the introduction of another Time Lord as a traveling companion, and that's a whole interesting story in and of itself. I'll see you tomorrow.